Hi, and welcome back for the next chapter with Pierre Jonker. Pierre, we've spoken about 18 months of our experience so far in the border war and in the South African Army. We've got 6 months to go. So it feels like we've said a lot, but welcome back once again. Nice to see you, mate.
Oh, thanks, Steve. And it's been great reliving the journey and even getting to hear some more of the stories that you and I have not shared yet. So yeah, thanks very much. Great.
Great, absolutely. So we ended off last time at the end of our time at Okatope base, and then we moved across to Okinkolo, which, as I remember, was a bit further north and deeper into the Badlands. Perhaps a little bit more happening around there with respect to enemy activity. And once again, it was a square base with an packed earth wall, 4 sandbags in the corners, and we were completely self-sufficient out there. I think we were probably 50 or 60 kilometers from Ondangwa. To me, it felt like we were right at the end of civilization, the last outpost. Although there were places that were further than us, like Inana and so on. But we were certainly in a very desolate area when we got there.
Yeah, Steve, I don't know if you remember, we actually did a sweep up from Okatope to Okankolo to occupy the base. And during that sweep up, Steve Orkers, we thought he'd shot himself, because the R4, only weakness in the R4 is it's got the floating firing pin. And what you did, I did it after every time I cocked my weapon. The firing pin would move forward and just tap on the percussion cap. But every time you tap on it, it becomes more and more weaker. The dent becomes bigger. And what Steve, so you rotated your rounds. And what Steve, he obviously hadn't done it. And about halfway through the stroll, he sat down and he slammed his R4 on the ground like this right next to his head and said, "I hate this shit." And bang, he grabbed his face and he fell over, and we thought he shot himself, but it was just the concussion of the shot that it frightened the hell out of him and out of us.
I don't remember that, Pierre. I don't remember that, because I never walked from Okatope to Okinkolo with you guys on that sweep operation. I managed to connive a lift on a truck. But so was Steve's safety catch on, but because of the faulty mechanism, it now fired off the shot? No safety catch.
Steve, Steve, that was an inherent fault in all the R4s, and we were told to do it. And so I used to do it religiously. But it's easy to forget. You get tired, you get a little bit lazy, you think you've exchanged it, you don't check the first round in the magazine. So it happens. It can happen. Yeah. And then the other thing that also around that time is that we got a new batch of officers. Cassie had left us. We had Roger Shaw for a while, but then Roger didn't stay long, and I don't know the reason why, but then we got Paul Einstein, we got Stan Besaidnout, we got Dave Bosman, I believe Alan Weyer, and some of the other, and some NCOs whose names unfortunately escaped. Potty was one of them, but Potty came to us with Paul. We had Van until that stage. Yeah, that was quite exciting, getting new blood in and then seeing the interaction between them and the troops. Now we thought we were big, tough guys. We'd been external and we'd done this and we'd seen gunships operate, so it's quite interesting. What I must say about Paul, and Potty had been around a bit, but about Paul is that he conducted himself extremely well, and he was willing to learn from us as much as we needed to learn stuff from him again. So I thought it worked out well between all of those, because none of those officers, in my opinion, came with massive attitude like some of the guys could have or did do in other places. So no, they came and they and I believe not one of them had any real weakness or fault in them. They all went on to do quite well in the military or in other walks of life.
Well, the difference was that they were national servicemen like us, and many of them were the same intake as us, so they were the same age as us. So effectively, we had a leadership change amongst our officer class from the permanent force officers who had taken us so far for nearly 15, 16 months. And we now had some of those guys were our pals. You know, we started off training with them, then they went off to junior leaders. It was very tough for them. Talking to them now, they had a hell of a challenge on their hands. I got the impression that they were arriving to now take over a platoon of Omana, of old men who'd been in the bush for quite a long time and who had been to Angola, and were in some respects more experienced in the bush than these officers were. But I agree with you, they played the balance well. They hung back, they didn't throw down their authority and try and take us by the grip of the throat. They sort of checked out the lie of the land. They walked the first 2-3 patrols, had a look at how we do things. They were sort of mature enough to be led in a way. You know, how do our troops do things? And then they slotted in, and each one brought their own personality to the different platoons. And today we're all still good friends, and yeah, to the man, they're good guys. Hell of a leadership challenge at age 19, 20 for them to come in and do that. An enormous leadership challenge, and one which I think has stood them in such good stead over the years. You know, they've all done well, become good men in life, and some of them have gone on to have strong businesses, just good guys, as have many of the other guys in the platoon, including quite a few of the section leaders and so on. Yeah, so Pierre, the patrols there, you know, I don't really have a sequential memory of the patrols we did in Okankolo. But a lot happened. A lot happened. It was a dark place. The bush was much more thickly wooded, and towards the end of our 3-month period at Okinkolo, we ran into the rainy season, which was altogether different, with big thunderclouds and occasional lightning and heavy downpours. We had nights where it rained right through the night, and we were sleeping in the bush in our TBs, and they were tough nights. And we walked a hell of a lot. We walked far and wide in search of the enemy. Once again, they were as elusive as ever. Yeah, what are your thoughts on the patrolling around Okinkolo at that time?
Steve, patrolling sums up Okinkolo. That was it. 8 days out, 2 days in, and you went back 8 days, and we just walked and we walked and we walked. And I remember the one patrol before the patrol, I got sick. I had diarrhea, and I can't remember who the other guy in the platoon was. There were 2 of us who stayed behind at the start of this patrol. And by about day 4 or 5, we were getting these reports from the radio guys that, listen, the boys in the platoon are sick. You know, they're all sick. They basically, and the first vehicles that went out to resupply, we jumped on with those and we came out. And I think the Casevac guys already then took them back. But, you know, it was one of the longer patrols we walked, and it was over 20 days. You know, in my mind it says 28, but I can't say that for sure. But I also remember that the 2 of us who came out later, we ended up on point just about all the time, because the guys were so weak by then. I believe that it was it you and Barry who carried Dave's kit, or
yeah,
you and Dave carried Barry's kit?
I remember you, Pierre, coming late towards the end of the patrol for whatever reason. You were brought out by a vehicle. I think your vehicle came to fetch some of our sick guys, but yeah, I was there from the beginning of that patrol. You're right, it was a very long one. And the guys slowly started going down with this mystery sickness. They got a terrible stomach bug to the point where they couldn't control their stomachs. And then they fell into a delirium. And they were wandering around the bush, you know, in a dwell. And at that point, you had to start carrying the guy's kit and carrying his rifle. And he was just sort of walking behind you like like a lapdog, but you had to keep checking he was there. He would wander off on his own. And then they started losing consciousness, and they'd go down, and they were severely dehydrated. And one by one, the guy started falling. We were very, very worried. At that stage, we were still on tin food, and I thought we've obviously eaten something really bad, and a bug has gone around. Looking back, I wonder if it was dysentery. I don't know. But there was a time when, you're right, Dave went down, Dave Lee, and we had to carry his kit. And poor guys, they were suffering. But it put a big burden on the rest of us, carrying 2 kit bags and another man's weapon. But you did it willingly. You were always in there for, to have the backs of your mate. And we looked after one another in good times and in bad, generally. And eventually one man went down. I think it was Loch Ness Slubbert, and he was losing consciousness, and we couldn't get a drip into him, just to put a saline drip up. It was really bad, And we lost about 15 or 16 out of the 24 men. And at some point around then, you arrived, and ultimately we were all taken back to the base. And I remember they put us on a diet of wheat picks, which just cleaned out. It was like bran. It flushed our systems out, and we got better thereafter. But yeah, it was horrible. We were far away from base. I was like, please don't let us walk into the enemy at this point. Tough patrols. I remember lots of different types of patrols. I remember thick bush, the locals being unfriendly. I remember in that thick bush, sometimes the sleeves of my shirt would be torn, and then my arms would be torn by the thorn bushes. And the frustration of struggling to find the enemy, which just went on and on and on. But there were also funny moments. I remember the camp doctor at Okankolo. He was a lot older than us. He'd been to medical school, and he was going on and on about how he wanted to go out on patrol to have the real border experience. And eventually we did a vehicle patrol, I think it was. We went out in Buffels, and he came along. And of course, by then we were old hands at sitting at the back of the vehicle on the bin and holding onto the roll bar, which was quite a precarious position as the vehicle bounced around. And he was struggling to hang on. He was quite a portly chap as well. And at some stage, we looked back, and he just wasn't there. He was gone. So he'd fallen off the back. It was quite high. And it wasn't like the driver had rear view mirrors to look for. But so the doctor had to patch himself up after that. And that was the first and last patrol that he went on. Yeah. What other moments of that time come to your mind?
Steve, there were 2 things, but I'll get to the finger at the end of the other few things I want to say. Was that to me, the bush or the whole feeling, the atmosphere, the vibe, if you want to go back to the 60s at Okankolo and in the bush, I didn't like it. There's in my memory, there's this, we were walking, and it was dark. It was like one of those days it was going to rain. My section was in front, extended line, and we came over this little rise, thickly wooded. And as we walked down, I just thought, no, something horribly wrong here. But nothing panned out, but it was just, I didn't like the feeling of that place. That was me. But then, like you talk about patrols, we had, I don't know if you remember Lieutenant Wingnut.
Yes.
Wingdust. We used to call him Wingnut. He was the intelligence officer.
That's right. Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah, he came out on a few patrols as well, but they were basically, again, like the Buffalo patrol. So you were out for a day, those day sweep things. And he tried to gain intelligence from the locals, and the locals were very uncooperative. They didn't speak to you. They would. It's almost like he's looking right. He'd be looking right past you, like looking over your left shoulder, like I'm doing now. Yeah. And you're talking to him, but he's not registering you. Or he is, but he's ignoring you. You don't exist. Go away. So yeah, but there were a couple of things, and I was going to ask you this before we go to the finger, is that we found a dead Turk that had been buried. Is that right?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get around that, and I can't place it, but yeah, please tell a bit more about that.
Yeah, I remember it vividly. We had been on patrol for quite a few days, far away, and finding that dead body, which was half buried in a shallow grave, it really meshed into the dark mood of the whole Okinkolo area. And I was walking point with Barry, so the two of us had the compass. And I came across it. I smelt it first, and it was sort of to my left. And I had a look, and then I saw, and it was apparent that the body had been hastily dug in this shallow grave, and that either dogs or jackals had then dug half the body out of it, and started gnawing on this body. He was wearing what appeared to be a Cuban jacket, and into the seam of his shirt, of his hemline, was sewn a ballistic round for an AK-47. Because I immediately, when I got there, went down and I just checked the body, and I felt that ballistic round. I pulled it out. And there were a lot of tracks around the area. There were a lot of vehicle tracks. So we got the impression that he had been chased for a long way and then had died. How the chasers avoided finding him, I don't know. And then probably what happened was the local headman or the nearest kraal, they came across the body. Their dogs would have been barking, and they, alarmed, quickly buried the body in a shallow grave. Perhaps either the army or Koevoet was still around. And so, yeah, it was an ominous thing to find. And it just, it cast a pall over that whole thing. But of course, not many contacts were happening once again. And eventually, after about a month or 5 or 6 weeks, they called in 32 Battalion to come down, base themselves at Okankolo, and to go out into this finger area. Now, I don't recall what that was. What was the finger area?
Finger area, Steve, if I remember correctly, is it was to the south and the east of Okinkolo. It was very dry. There was not much water in there. There was almost no population in there, and I think the belief was that and it wasn't a very in distance. It wasn't an incredibly wide place. It was quite long, so it's like a finger pointing to the east, if I remember correctly. And we had been in there. All the platoons had gone in there, and we'd come out with lemons. And so eventually they decided they wanted 3-2 to go in, and they were going to sweep this place and look after it. And I remember we were on the edge of the finger somewhere, and 3-2 in the area. They radioed us and said they're coming in. And when the guy finished talking, he was standing next to the HQ group. They'd walked right through the platoon. We can see
out in the bush.
And the bush. Look, it was thick. It was thick. It was green, but to me, it just attested to either us becoming blasé, and we can talk a little bit about that in the Alpha Tower thing, if you want to. But they were also exceptionally good soldiers. They knew what they were doing. They did this for a living.
The enemy. You're talking about the enemy.
Yeah, no, 3-2 did this for a living. They were hunting and hunted every day almost if they were in Angola. So you couldn't relax. You couldn't make a cup of coffee or milkshake type of thing. So that's what I remember that. But I think you had more interaction with them, didn't you? Did you not swap some stuff with them, or is that am I thinking the wrong thing here?
Yeah, that was with the Koevoet guys, but I clearly remember.
Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah.
I clearly remember the 32 Battalion guys coming in, and they with their camouflage berets, and we were in awe of them. Of course, we had seen them on Ops Meerbos, and they were much older than us. They, although perhaps not in years, they may have only been 23, 24 years old, but they had deeply lined furrows. And as you say, this was their job out there, in southern Angola in a far more intense war than where we were, hunting people down, and there had been a lot of casualties, and they were very much the real deal. But as I recall, despite your story about that 32 Battalion guy, even they struggled to find the enemy in the Finger area. So the enemy at that stage, in the latter half of 1982, either they were not pushing many insurgents down that corridor at Okankolo, or the enemy had become very, very proficient at hiding themselves in the bush and avoiding us. It was very annoying, and so much so, we were struggling so much to get hold of, to find them, that our company commander, that captain who wasn't very popular amongst the guys, he then decided to form his own squad of 10 or 12 guys who would go out at night. They would put on black is beautiful camouflage, and this was supposed to be an intelligence gathering mission. And we were quite disparaging about them, that we called them the Captain's Angels, which was after a TV program at the time called Charlie's Angels, if you remember. Yeah. And Pierre, by that stage, I have to say, halfway through Okinkolo, we had been on the border for 4.5 months, pushing 5 months. It was too long. We were extremely frustrated. The guys were getting out of control. The discipline was breaking down in the bush. I remember things like, we would be told to walk a certain route on a patrol, and we wouldn't. We'd shortcut the route just because we were tired of walking. We were gutful, as we used to say. It seemed so futile. And we spent more time sitting in kraals and in cooker shops, drinking the local beer, the Mahangu beer, and maybe buying beers and taking shortcuts. So we got slack, and we were tired, man. And the petty antagonisms in the platoon, which had been nothing up until that point, started becoming more serious, and punch-ups and broke out, and flare-ups. And it was a very unhappy period to me, to my soul. And it was at that point that the captain composed this team of 10 or 12 guys and sent them out. And they got into a lot of trouble out in the bush here. Do you remember what they did, or what happened there, what that was about?
I don't remember the incident, but I know that they assaulted civilians to try and get information, or a civilian, because they couldn't get information. Those people were not talking. So, if you can't win their hearts and minds, grab them by the nuts. But I think also part of it, and it's not condoning what happened, was that the frustration, like you alluded to, and the wanting to go home. You've been there, you had a rotation home after that. We went home after Okinkolo, but leading up that last month was internal. It just dragged on endlessly, and the frustration and the heat, the rain, the crappy food, 2 tins between 3 guys twice a day. It all boiled over. So much so that I witnessed we were there, we didn't perpetrate it, but we caught up to the bike squad one day, and we patrolled with them for the day. And I remember they got hold of these 2 young black guys. Young in the sense.
Let me interrupt you there, Pierre, and just remind us, what was the bike squad again?
The bike squad, I believe they trained in Potch. They used XR 500s. And they rode around the bush looking for planned fighters. Now, a buffle is quieter than an X500. So to my mind, they were really superfluous to needs. They could have used those men, in my opinion, far better patrolling on the air bases like Ondangwa Air Base or Ruakana, because there will be a fast reaction force at a place like that if trouble hits the fan. But again, hindsight's 2020, and I'm an armchair tactician. I never went to any formal combat training, but yeah. So they would patrol through the bush, much the same as we did, but they were on 2 wheels. We seemed like a lot of fun, and then they got hold of these 2 young men. And there was some slaps and some punching involved. And then they made the one guy dig a hole in the sand. And he made he had to stick his head in there, and his friend had to bury his head. Steve, now to my internal discredit, I never did anything. You know, and I remember the one guy had a white shirt on, and the other guy had a black and white striped shirt this way down with long pants. And, you know, but again, I think frustration, just not wanting to fall out with your peers, trying to fit in, you don't do anything. But it has, you know, the fact that I remember what they looked like, what they were dressed in, to me says a lot about how that is stuck in my mind and my memory. And I wish I could find those guys and apologize.
Yeah.
Too late, but that's what I feel like. And I think the same. And I think you know more about the Captain's Angels incidents. If you could, you know, I think the same thing there. Yeah, if you can talk a bit about that.
Well, I was initially in the Captain's Angels. That captain had forced me into it, but I fell out pretty quickly. I developed an allergy to Black is Beautiful cream, so I couldn't camo up, and I was very glad that I did. I forget the details of the incident, and when you talk to the guys about it today, they're quite cagey about it, but they buried a headman or someone and sort of buried him alive, and he trying to extract information from him about where the enemy was. I mean, you know, we were also crazed by that point and frustrated, and he got out of that situation alive, and he reported them to the local police, who then contacted the army, and it was ultimately tracked back to our guys at Okankolo. So I think that is what happened. But you know, Pierre, I have found the past few hours of talking about these things and some of these more difficult incidents. We spoke a while back in our first part about the Koevoet incidents. I found them difficult to speak about and to reflect on, and they've always weighed heavily on my mind and to wrap my thoughts around them. And you say something to the effect of, to your regret, you did nothing at that incident where they were beating up that guy or mishandling him. And the way I've thought about it is that along the way, at the time, 3, 4, 5 months into that border trip when we were now at Okankolo, I really didn't like the way that our collective consciousness was turning, where we would come across a guy who appeared to be a suspect. We would grab him and we'd interrogate him. And there were some pretty tough interrogations that happened out there in the bush. And some of the guys were more willing than others to deal out the blows, you know. Instinctively, it did not sit well with me, what we were doing. And I was developing quite a moral conscience. And yet I couldn't share it with people. I could only share it with one person, and that was with Dave Lee, because he and I had become close friends by then. And I confided in him and said, look, I'm really unhappy with what's happened to us. It is as if our mentality has become a collective thing, and we have lost our individuality, and there's not enough authority out here in the bush to keep things disciplined and to stick to the codes of conduct that we had been taught. We used to have to carry around a little slip of paper that said we shall adhere to the code of conduct and that we won't commit atrocities in the bush and so on. And the guys are not sticking to this. But you know, what had happened was that this collective mentality of the platoon had taken such a twisted bend and had become the prevailing behavior. This is how I felt, that it became dangerous to stand up against it. It became dangerous to oppose it and voice your opposition to it, because you then felt you would become a victim of it. So I think there were quite a few guys who felt the way I was feeling. And from what you've said, clearly you were as well. And yet we kept our silences. I just resolved personally with myself that I wasn't going to participate in it. And I said, this is a very dark period in my life. I never imagined that this combat experience I wanted of fighting in a war on the border, that it would get down to this. And I told myself, look, mate, you've got another 6 months or so to the end of this national service conscription, then you can get out and you can start your life again and leave this chapter behind you. But it was very, very disconcerting to me. And, you know, there were lots of things that happened like that. And a lot was influenced by the Koevoet. The Koevoet then started spending a lot of time at the camp as well. They were having more success than we were at tracking down the enemy. So it's not like there were not contacts in the bush. They were going on around us, but it was Koevoet that was getting them. And then eventually we wound up with Koevoet in the latter half of our Okinkolo tenure, being virtually permanent residents at Okankolo. So we saw a lot of them. We got to know the guys. What do you remember of Koevoet being there at the time, if anything?
Steve, yeah, I remember seeing them. I remember them coming in, and also again, you're in a little bit of awe of these guys because not all the stories are filtered down to you yet, you know, and they just looked like a very hard bunch of guys. They were friendly enough, you know, not that, but these are guys that you wouldn't want to mess with. And I know they were successful. It goes back to my love for mixed teams, for teams. Anyway, so yeah, they did. I think you got to know one of. Well, before I ask you that question, I just want to tell you something else that I remember. We were doing a night patrol in Funky Town on Buffaloes. Now, curfew was when darkness set in, and so we drove into Funky Towns and we ran into these 2 civilian vehicles with about 5 or 6 people inside or on the back of the buckies, and you know, we stopped them immediately, and the one guy got out, and I can't remember. I think it was Roger Shaw was still with us. Went over to him and said to him, "Look, I'm white." So these turned out to be Koevoet guys who were, well, you know, they had Caspers at Okinkolo, so these guys were just driving around in civilian buckies as a KSP, a Kaksoek patrolling, you know, searching for business essentially. Yeah. I remember that very well, and also remember that they went past us up the road, as well as the Chandelier, the road that went up to Italy,
yes.
North.
Yes.
Yeah, and they hit landmines on that road because they didn't remember spooking the pad. You spooky pad. You drive next to it. You know, if it's not been swept, if you're not sure it's been swept, and they didn't bother. They just stuff it. We'll just go down the middle, and they lost some Caspers down there. But you've got a far more interesting story to my mind because you met one of the black sergeants and traded some stuff with him.
You know, I don't know why, but there was a time when I was in the camp and you guys were out patrolling. I think I had twisted my ankle. I had some injury, and it was probably a 10-day period. And during that time, a Casper came in with a sergeant called Jonas Paulus. And I spoke to him in the canteen. We just got a conversation going, and he spoke Afrikaans because he had been down at the police college in Pretoria studying or getting his promotion down there. And I was quite taken by this guy. And early on in the conversation, he asked me could he buy or swap an item of clothing for my army jersey, because the Koevoet never had jerseys. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll swap it for your cap. So that's how I think we got chatting. But this guy, you know, a day or two later, he went out in the bush, and there was a big ambush up at Funky Town at Ondangwa, where 7 Koevoet were after hours drinking in a cooker, and they were ambushed. They were sort of pissed, and they were careless, and their rifles were lying around, and 2 enemy walked in and mowed them down. I was in the base when that report came through. You guys were in the bush, and it was like a big thing. You know, we have to react to this. And in the follow-up to that, they picked up the spoor the next morning of the 2 enemy, and they hunted them down. And Jonas and his Casper caught one of them, and they brought him back to Okinkolo. And his Casper came through the gate and parked next to the tents. And I wandered over, and he got out the Casper, and he said to me, "Kyk, ons het een gekry." And he pointed into the back. And there was sitting this capture. And he was in a sort of leopard skin camo, full camo, and he had his AK-47 with him. And he was older than us as well. He must have been in his mid-20s, and a hard guy. And you could see that, he was putting on a brave front, but he was also genuinely a hard guy. He had the steely look in the eyes. He looked me straight in the eye, like, so what are you going to do about it, type of thing. And Jonah said something to the effect of, he's a senior guy, he's a detachment commander. And that guy had trained in Russia and in East Germany. And then he had come across the border with a group of 70 men. And that was 3 years before. And they were down to 4 men, of which that morning 2 had been captured, including himself. So, I mean, wow, that really struck me, I was, man, there are some really experienced enemy out there who have survived beyond, what you would think is possible against great odds. And I still remember that one of the troops climbed up onto the Casbah, and the prisoner was sitting looking up, because the Casbah had the slit open roof. Yeah. The prisoner was looking, just staring like this at us, and the troop just casually kicked him on the side of the head, and the troop had his boots on. And the prisoner fell over, and Jonas got extremely angry. He pulled his pistol out and he pointed it at the troop and told him to F off and get off my Casbah and so on. And it was this unusual circumstance in the war. I'd never seen it before, where you had a black sergeant, which was unusual. We didn't see many of those, we lived in this apartheid world. A black sergeant who had authority over us white troops, pointing a gun at one of the white troops and telling him to bugger off. And he was doing it standing in solidarity with the enemy. It was really bizarre, And then, so that guy later on joined Koevoet. And I don't want to go too long with the story, but Jonas, he then also told me that his family, he had something like 7 brothers. 4 of them had joined SWAPO, 3 had joined our own Koevoet side. And of the brothers, they'd come back and they had murdered his mother, and to prove to other SWAPO guys that they were genuine and that their brothers were sellouts and their mother was, I don't know. But he had a terrible story. I had no way of verifying the story. But it sounded terrible what he'd gone through. And the one brother had, I think 3 had been killed, 1 had been captured and was now in Koevoet. It was this terribly mixed up situation that he'd been fighting the war forever. And he was a ruthless bugger, that Jonas. He was a brutal bugger. And that was November of 1982. And about 2 months later, he was arrested for murder and for rape. And he was tried in a civilian court in Windhoek. I still have the newspaper article. And he was sentenced to death and he was hanged. And to the best of my knowledge, he's the only Koevoet who was hanged for misdeeds, committed during that time. Yeah, so the Koevoet had a big impact on us, I think. But it's all very heavy stuff, and it was in line with, how heavy the times were and how dark the mood was. And yeah, I mean, can you think of any other, shall we change the mood a bit? Funny things that happened there.
Well, everybody's favorite, Oupa.
Oupa.
Yeah, I know you've got that story about him. I'll let you tell it once I've told mine, but I'll clearly remember Oupa walking in from outside up to the main gate just after daylight, because he'd been out with some dark damsel the night before, and he made no secrets of it. I think it happened everywhere. I mean, there was an incident at the cooker shop at Okatope, and he kept doing this, and it was like, not in your face, but what you're going to do it, because Oupa was just built of testosterone. I mean, I think if you punched him in the arse, you'd break your fingers, type of thing, because he was a very solid guy. Yeah, I remember him, and not too much else of the guys there, but I know you've got a story. Well, you've got a story about Oupa, well, that fight, which is also quite which is very funny.
Oh yeah, that's right. So it was at our, our crazy time, 5, 6 months into the trip, and there was a braai held in Okankolo for the local HQ staff and for, I think, maybe a platoon was back. And Opa by that stage, I never knew him well, so I don't want to talk bad about him, but it was just an entertaining thing that happened. He had wound up as the guy who was doing the braaiing. So the chefs brought the meat over, and Opa was now handling the braai forks, And there was a lot of drinking going on and shenanigans. And one of the guys made the mistake of accusing Opa of burning the meat. You never accuse the braai master of burning the meat, especially not in a war. When the guys have been a long time there and they are rattled and quick to lose their temper. But so he and Opa got into a fight, and very quickly the guys gathered round and cleared a sort of space for them to fight. There's much cheering for both sides, and the guy who was opposing Opa was a huge kid, Afrikaans boy. They both had their fists up, and the Afrikaner guy was punching down. And these two adhered to the Queensberry rules for the first sort of part of the fight. And then Opa, just as you say, he was stocky and strong. He just the sheer weight of blows, he was going like Mike Tyson. Eventually, this huge guy buckled and went down to his knees. It was classic. It was like watching a boxing match. And this huge guy clung to Opa's knees, put his head up against it. Opa was now raining blows down at him. And then Opa, he started reciting poetry in the fight, which was a very unusual thing to witness. And I remember him taking the guy's head by the hair and turning his head sideways, and he hit him on the ear. Oh, and the guy screamed in pain, and he said, I was in prison. And then he turned the head the other way and he hit the other ear, and the guy screamed in pain, and Opa said, "What's your mission?" And yeah, I thought that prison and mission didn't really rhyme. They were only half rhymes. But I wasn't about to have an intellectual debate about English literary semantics at that point. But I must say his poetry improved, because he then did it again. He turned and he hit the guy and he said, "You pick on my braai, I make you fry." This poetry went on for some time, and it was quite brutal. Everybody went silent. We were in the midst of a fighting Shakespeare. It was most unusual. And eventually the poetry got so much that a corporal jumped in and pulled them apart. So yeah, Pierre, those were the kind of characters we were dealing with there, at the time. Yeah, it was a wild time, man.
Yeah. It was, yeah. And if I may, just I think the last thing that we could touch on at Okatope before we went on 14 days, I believe we got 14 days after those 6 months, was that, you remember the sweeping, clearing the road, doing the sweeping down the road, and then also running convoys or escort for convoys at the post, which was very important to all of us, getting to do the post run, and because you got parcels from home, and part of that was also our rats came in on those convoys. So we did a little bit of that, and they did break the monotony a little bit. Didn't like the yeah. So I don't know how many of those you did, or how well you remember them. But I like the post runs, because they were you got into town.
Yes. And often those postal runs, which were through to Ondangwa and back, combined with the minesweepers sweeping the road in the morning, and they would walk halfway to town, and eventually they reached a point where there was the wreckage of a bakkie on the side of the road. That was the halfway mark, and other guys walked from town this way. So I guess each side did about 20 k's. It would take until midday to get there, and only then was the road declared safe and open, and we would have to walk alongside the buffels as protection. A lot of the guys didn't like that. They found it very vulnerable and so on. I thought it was a lot safer than being in the bush, when you could stumble across the enemy at any time. Other highlights, Pierre, of Okinkolo. I remember us swimming in the dams that we used to come up to, the Shaunas, and we used to have a talk with us. We had 1 or 2 interpreters, Owambo guys, They were locals and they were characters. They would assist when we were interrogating, questioning villagers. And, they used to trap birds, and it was interesting watching how they operated. They used to make these little cages, which we had tried and we couldn't get right at all. And I just remember it being a wild time. On patrol, we'd take the B-52 radio receiver and put it in the fire bucket and listen to, try and pick up a radio station back home. And then a lot of wildness in the camp itself. I mean, when we got back to the camp after patrols, those nights were out of control. I mean, we were only supposed to drink 2 beers each, but we all had a way of scoring extra beer, or bottle of Coca Rico from there, or Old Brown Sherry from there. There were times we had to stand guard in the 4 bunkers, if you remember, we were on rotation through the night, and be sitting there with my Walkmans on, listening to Neil Young. So these melancholic songs from home, which were so much at odds with this very hard place, But the time I felt like, the guys, do you remember that platoon that was out there causing trouble in the bush? I don't know what they did, but they were summoned back to base, and the sergeant major, old Mayor, was so furious with them that as they walked down the road to the base, he threw mortars at them. He threw mortars from Okankolo at his own troops in the bush, and the guys scattered into the bush, and he wouldn't let them in. He said, now you camp outside and think about what you've done. I mean, try and tell that to the kids today,
Yes, I remember, Steve, because they had to sleep other side of the runway. Remember the runway that ran along?
Terrible one. Yeah.
Yeah, and often we would actually, if we knew there were not many aircraft came in and landed there, but they did come, and we would actually have to patrol down to the end of the runway, or send a section down there to wait for the plane to land. But I remember that platoon. I still don't know what they caused, and I don't know who they are, but I'm sure we can find out somehow. They had to sleep for I don't know how long on the other side of the runway. They weren't allowed to come in and shower. They weren't allowed to use the toilets. They weren't allowed to get their parcels. That's where they, if I remember correctly, that's where they stayed. And I think they lived on rats. They were taught to live on rats. Or rat packs, or the tins. I've only got rat packs at Alpha. But yeah, so I remember, and I don't know who they are, but I remember clearly they had to stay on the other side of the runway.
I remember that absolutely clearly. And they had to stay there for a while, a couple of days, 3 or 4 days. And I sometimes found, well, towards the end of the Okinkolo period, I thought that it was actually more dangerous to be in base with that bunch and that sergeant major than it was to be out in the bush. I'd rather be in the bush taking my chances with the enemy, because we had that POW, prisoner of war hawk, that cage. You remember that? And every now and then a prisoner would be locked up in there. It was a horrible thing. But one night we had, it was Cully, who was in one of the other platoons. He told the captain it was his 21st. And so the captain allowed him and his section, a couple of pals, to have a big piss up that night. They, unlimited beer. And they got completely drunk. And they were causing trouble. The music was blaring. They had a punch up with another platoon. They blitzed them down half the wall of the canteen. And the captain then went and checked on Cully's birth date, and turned out that Cully was 23, and it wasn't his. So the captain came storming into the canteen, confronting Cully, and Cully then decided, far from backing down, he decided it was a good time to kill the captain. So he cocked his arc off and tried to shoot the captain, and the captain ran, gone, and Cully was now chasing the captain around the base, and it was great sport. Oh man, we were hoping that Cully would catch him. I tell you, we were really hoping, but.
Unfortunately, he didn't.
The captain then got some of the corporals, some of the rank together, and they found Cully, and they put him in the POW hawk. That's why I remember the POW hawk, And I remember one night, Classy getting into an altercation with the Koevoet in the bar. Classy stole their drink, and then Classy, very unwisely, chose to stab one of the Koevoet in a fight. Wow, that was something, man! I tell you. And then Classy ran. So now the Koevoet came around the camp looking for him, and the Koevoet, armed to the teeth with their AKs and cutlasses and bloody, I tell you, they came into the tent. I was lying in the tent. I thought, what the hell is going on? And they just barged in, 12, 13 of them. with murder in their eyes. How classy got out of that one, I don't know. We were laughing about it the other day. Yeah.
Yeah, you can tell us at some stage.
You can tell us. Anyhow, Pierre, so I suppose that brings us to the end of Okankolo, hey, which takes us through to what?
Yeah, I think we've covered it all, Steve. As far as I remember, my time at Okankolo. I also remember when we just before we move on to Alpha Towers, that the relief of leaving that camp, it was like shaking, moving out from underneath a dark cloud. When we got on that flossie in Ondangwa, I was one of the happiest guys on this earth. And I believe we got 14 days, and then we came back because we did do that 6-month stint, which was quite unusual.
Yeah.
And then we did 14 days from that, and then we went back and we ended up at a place right on top of the Angolan border.
That's right. And just before we get there, Pierre, we had that very long pass. It was over Christmas and New Year. I remember being at home going surfing, and oddly enough, missing the guys in the platoon, missing the border, missing being on patrol, and stupidly, it was unbelievable. I wanted to get back there. You know, that's how much the war had got to me. What are your memories of that long pass that we had?
Steve, not too much. I know that I just went home and I spent it with my parents, and that was, my brother was still up in Walvis Bay then, but he was on his way. The papers had come through for him that he could come and live in his hometown in PE. And I just thought, you know, that's actually very nice to finagle something like that, because he came home. And so it was in PE. I did, probably same thing. You know, I just went and I went to the beach, checked out the girls, got a little bit drunk, just did my thing. And then, but it to my mind, it passed very quick. Yes. Before you knew it, you were on that buffle on the way down to PE to get on the flossie to fly back up.
Yeah. In fact, when I think about it, Pierre, at the end of that pass, I was in Cape Town at my parents' house. I then went to Wynberg Military Hospital to 2 Mill to have an eye operation. And I had got a splinter of something in the corner of my eye. Something had, and I couldn't work out how it had got there. And I thought maybe it was a little piece of a fleck of metal or shrapnel from when the landmine went off or whatever. But it got so bad, my eye was swelling up. I went to the doctor. I was about to come back to Grahamstown, and he said, "No, there's a piece of metal in here. We're going to have to operate on you." And, you know, how did you get it? So I said, well, you know, being on the border, you know, so lots of action and shrapnel flying around, and you know, played the hero. And so I had a bit of an operation there. They took that out. It was just a small thing, and then I returned late to Grahamstown. So that, as you say, Pierre, takes us on to our second last trip, Alpha Tower. Yeah, it's been good chatting about this one. I wonder if we should break off and start a new recording for that.
Oh, Steve, I'm happy to do that. Then we can just do Alpha as well as Golf Ops, where I went to. You didn't go there, but I think we cover that in another chat.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to say thanks once again. It's been fun reminiscing on that one, and I'm going to end this recording. Very good once again. Thanks, Pierre.
Steve. Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. Sorry for interruption. Thanks a lot, man. It's actually quite nice talking about Okinkolo almost in its entirety and what happened there, because I've suppressed it actually, and I think that's why when you ask me things, I'm quite vague about things, and yeah. But it's been good talking about it, and actually I'm glad we touched on some subjects that are almost taboo in our lives, where you suppress the feeling, or you get the image and you move straight along as fast as you can. So yeah, thanks very much, Steve, and I look forward to the next one.
Perfect. Yeah, and I agree with you. It's been really nice having an open conversation with you about those sorts of things after all these decades of not talking about it. All right, I'm signing out. I'm saying goodbye. Cheers then, Pierre.
Cheers, Steve.